All right. Hey, Sam, how are you doing? Happy Friday. Welcome to the long
Hi.
game. Thanks for making time.
Thank you. Happy Friday, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I've been paying attention to some of your work and OpenView over the last couple of years when you first started coining product-led growth, which we'll get into. And we'll just jump into the conversation here. And I think a good place to start is you were an operator before you were in VC. Tell us about that career arc. What was it like being an
Yeah.
operator? How'd you end up in VC?
Well, I always like to caveat all of my conversations with I'm not really a VC. But I could go into that a little bit more as I talk about the arc. I like sort of found myself in VC. I never really like meant to go into it. Um, I started my career working in like governmental consulting. I actually majored in political science and was really excited
Yeah.
about like solving large problems for the world. But I graduated at a time in which all of the large governmental agencies were not hiring anyone. So I quickly found myself bored in government work. It tends to be a little bit slower paced. And I tend to be like a bull in a china shop in places like that. So bureaucracy and I are not friends. I started working at a marketing agency and found a lot better fit. These were sort of the early days of digital marketing and attribution. So I was sort of like the back of shop person who was doing a lot of spreadsheet action and working with clients to
Yeah.
make sure that we were optimizing for them. And then I moved in-house to a startup called Hourly Nerd here in Boston, which is now known as Catalant. They were very early days. I think I was the 11th hire. And I was running sort of all marketing operations, sales operations, and paid acquisition. So again, big spreadsheet girl, big into operations and optimization. But I got to work with Dan Slagan, who's the CMO at the time, who's really wonderful and was a HubSpot alum. And I learned a lot about brand and how to run B2B marketing. From there, I moved on to a company called Dispatch, where I was brought on as the head of marketing. But then realized very quickly that I didn't necessarily need to be a marketer in the formal sense because we only had a few potential customers that we could have. But in order to be really successful with their customers, we had to figure out how to onboard hundreds of thousands of service providers, so plumbers, electricians, etc., who didn't necessarily love technology. So I spent a lot of time on
Mhm.
planes teaching plumbers, etc., how to use their mobile phones and mobile apps. And through that time, I had a lot of really interesting um, sort of lightnings, lightning thoughts around how we could build the product to make my job easier, and how we could build our messaging to make my job easier, and how we could build all of these things so that I wouldn't necessarily need to be on a plane all of the time. So at the time, I didn't really realize it. I called myself the head of growth, and I was just pulling as many levers as possible to avoid these one-to-one discussions I was having with folks. And I didn't necessarily realize what I was doing at the time was product-led growth. But in speaking with
Mhm.
the team at OpenView, once I sort of was looking around at my next move after we had sold Dispatch to Vista Equity Partners, I very clearly realized what I was doing was on that verge, and I had learned a lot by doing, and I had already made a lot of connections in that space that I was really trying to learn from. So the transition over to VC felt very natural to me because I was going to be doing product led growth and implementing product led growth at a lot of OpenView's portfolio companies at the time, and I've been here ever since.
That is so fascinating. I just had another conversation with Thomas Schiavone. He's a
Okay.
co-founder of Calixa. He was
Oh
like
yeah,
first
yeah, I
PM
know
at
Thomas.
Twilio.
Yep,
Yeah, first PM
he's
at
brilliant.
Twilio. And he was like, yeah, we
Yeah,
were doing product-led sales before it was a thing. And
yeah,
I asked him this question, so I'm curious how you thought about it. But when you're trying to build kind of those new motions into your product and that customer journey, how are you even thinking about that? If there's other people, you didn't really have people who already done it that
yeah.
much. So how do you model yourself? What do you model yourself after? How do you figure out those new user experiences?
Yeah. I mean, I've always looked to B2C. Um, I was a huge fan of Joanna Lord, who worked really closely in B2C. I look a lot at online dating applications because they are
Mm,
subscription based and they are just optimizing really hard to move you into something. And I also look at social media because ultimately, these guys are like the masters of psychology. They have millions and millions of users. They know what people want and they know how to move people in that direction by hook or by crook. And I find so much inspiration in those types of products And I feel like the B2B world should do that more frequently. And what I think is most interesting, especially when you think about hiring, is people always want the Thomases in the world who've worked at Twilio and been there. But I think that there's a lot to be said for folks who've come from this high velocity testing background, like someone from Kayak or someone from Hinge or something like that too. So I'd like to see more mixing in the space.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago, there was this phrase of like the consumerization of B2B. And I feel like that phrase has faded away a little bit, but I know recently you've been talking about how, it's B2B, but you're still selling to humans. So why aren't we seeing more of these user experiences reflected in these business products? And it sounds like that's something you look for a lot in your portfolio companies. And maybe we can kind of go into that. You mentioned you're in VC, but you're not a VC. Yeah. What does a VP of growth at a VC firm do?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. OpenView is pretty unique in that we have actually a larger quote unquote platform team than we do an investment team. So our platform is made up of ecosystem, talent, growth, and capital markets. Capital markets is a lot of former bankers. We help our companies exit the way that they want to, in a way that makes sense for the fund. Talent is easy to comprehend, at least, not necessarily easy to execute on. We have a wonderful team that helps our portfolio companies and potential investments hire some of the best talent in the market, not just at an executive level, but also at an IC level. And then we have our ecosystem team, which makes really important introductions, not only as customers, but also as mentors and potential board members. And then finally, the growth team, which is made up of myself, Kyle Poyer, and Kurt Townshend. We work really closely with our portfolio and potential prospects on ways that they can improve their go-to-market. So things like pricing and packaging, things like strategy in terms of acquisitions, things like implementing best practices from product-led growth, things like optimizing their onboarding. We help potential prospects as well as portfolio companies make those changes, almost like an in-house consulting firm.
Yeah, it really sounds like an agency of sorts, but your clients are all the portfolio companies, and I imagine you have a stake in helping them succeed too. So there's actually
I certainly do. Yeah. There's a lot of skin in the game, and it's just nice to have like the long-term relationship where, I've worked with someone's data for 2 years at this point. I know where the skeletons are buried, so to speak. Yeah. So I know why certain changes won't necessarily make sense. So it's a lot more of a relationship based. And they always have me to turn to in case they need sort of like an interim head of growth, or they want someone to talk to about something that's completely innovative and they may not have the talent in-house for it.
Yeah, that's a great model. I've gotten on some calls with founders and they're like, how should I solve this problem? Like, give me access to your data. Let's talk about what else is going. We're not going to solve this in a 30-minute call. Let's have a couple calls and work through it. But it seems like a great way to actually get familiar with the business. And you're not just signing a check and then like, good luck or anything like that. See them once a quarter.
Well, and what I've found is some of the greatest growth minds in the industry today are really looking to go out on their own and really sort of be consultants. So what I like to think of a lot of my role is I build a roadmap for an IC to come in and execute. I hear from founders quite a bit that they need someone who's strategic to say or to like make a plan to do certain things. And then they need the team to execute on it. So I think it helps fill that gap too, because a lot of these companies are unable to hire some of the top talent as heads of growth because very fairly, they don't necessarily want to have a 9-to-5 anymore.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about product-led growth, PLG. I know it's been a few years now since this has become a more mainstream concept. I don't know if you can call it actually mainstream yet, but if you could define that for the listeners, because some people will call it bottoms up, some people call it freemium, some people call it self-service. How do you define product-led growth?
Yeah, well, so I subscribe to the Blake Bartlett School of Product-Led Growth. He's a partner at OpenView, or he was the original investor in Calendly. He's wonderful, and he actually coined the term in 2016. But the definition that I like to use is where the product itself is the engine of acquisition, monetization, and retention. If you think about the product doing a lot of the heavy lifting, it changes a lot of your go-to-market. So when you see a product doing those things for the bulk of the users, that's when I would say that becomes product led. So a lot of people will say that's freemium or they'll say that's free trial. I don't necessarily always agree. I think there's definitely a spectrum. But I think that's like a really good example of a way that you can look at a product and decide whether or not it's product led.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to kind of ground the rest of the conversation. And right before this, so you had mentioned that one of the challenges you're seeing founders run into is around more the acquisition piece.
Yes.
Why is that? What do you see founders running into nowadays?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is we all have goldfish brains, right? We're all on TikTok. We're all not really willing to pay attention to a lot of things. But I also think when you design something and you really fall in love with it, it's hard to take a step back and say, what is the main value proposition of this product to someone who has no idea what it is? So, in going back into product-led sales, I think that the companies that are in the product-led sales realm have done a really good job of making their products problem first. Where the problem is like, I have all this data on what my users are doing, but I have no idea how to tie it back to sales. But there are other spaces in which that doesn't happen at all. So one of the reasons why Expensify was so successful over sort of like other products who were behemoths who were in the same space, the expense reporting space, was because they went after that consumer and they said, expense reports suck. That was their entire value proposition. They went after that user pain and like what they were solving for rather than, hey, we're going to make your expense reporting so much faster, and they went after that finance persona. I think it's really solving for that end user pain and making sure that message comes through in every single thing that you do and how you speak to the world.
Yeah, Expensify was great. I remember the days of using Concur. I don't know if you ever used that.
Yes.
I used to have to block
I've
out
actually
like
never
2
used
hours.
them.
Oh, I'm good. I mean, that's fortunate for you.
Yeah.
It was not fun, especially once those expenses started adding up. But I think this is all interesting to me because I was at HubSpot for 5 years. They were one of the B2B SaaS companies that was an existing business that implemented product-led growth after the fact, which I was fortunate to get front row seats and be a part of that whole thing. What B2B SaaS companies are doing product-led growth well that stand out to you?
Oh, I mean, there's I don't know. For example, HubSpot has done it well, and I think that they've navigated the transition really well. Because they were very much inbound marketing. They were very sales led. I mean, they wouldn't build product until they were selling it. If you think that Dan Lyons is accurate in his writing, which I was just like, HubSpot's a great company after I read that book.
I actually have not read that book, but I have an idea.
I just it was hard for me to see eye to eye with him because I was like, they're doing all the best things. But so I think that they've done a really good job sort of showing the world that you can transition from a sales-led model on a very heavy product. I mean, to get a ton of value out of HubSpot, you have to be really committed. But they've figured out different ways and paths to get there, and it's taken them years. But other companies that are, fully what I say, like PLG native, Notion's obviously done a really wonderful job of building for their most passionate users and then expanding beyond that. I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Calendly, who's one of the best product-led companies in the world. And then I think that there's an opportunity for a lot of companies who weren't necessarily product-led or weren't necessarily selling into a product-led market, specifically in the security space, to really emerge. I'm a huge fan of Gray Noise. I'm also, Okta has also started to make that transition to becoming more product-led with a trial. And then JumpCloud is also in the OpenView portfolio. They've done a really great job of sort of building on sort of this core and then making it more product-led over time too.